Welcome to the Everyday Citizens Tactical Podcast, episode 45, The American Rifleman. My name is Jeremy and I will be your host. Today I'm joined by the civilian rifleman, best known for his YouTube content where he promotes the ideals of the armed and prepared citizenry. Today we discuss the meaning of the Second Amendment, the state of affairs for the United States, and the world of geopolitics. So, let's dive in.
Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Straight the numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours. Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Straight the numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours.
All right, welcome back to the podcast, everybody, and civilian rifleman, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, hey, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to it since we first started chatting a few weeks ago. So,
Absolutely. It was actually kind of hard to get a hold of you because your Instagram is nowhere near the size of your YouTube channel at this point.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know what happened with YouTube. I guess they just really kind of started pushing my content, but everything else, from Instagram and X and a lot of my other socials, they haven't really been doing much. But in all fairness, I've been kind of neglecting them a little bit too. So, kind of on me.
I mean, for whatever reason, YouTube seems to flow a little bit better for people with kind of more detailed content versus Instagram. People like short, very generic content on Instagram, it seems, whereas YouTube, you can kind of expand upon it and then it kind of feeds the algorithm a little bit better because our YouTube is way bigger than our Instagram is.
Yeah, I've run into that a lot too, and I think the funny thing is, like, in my personal life too, when it comes to a lot of social medias like X and Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff. I mean, I don't even use them because I'm not really all that interested in them. So it's kind of hard, being a in the situation I'm in of trying to build a business and grow my reach and all that stuff when I'm not even really all that good at any of that stuff. So
Sure. Well, for those that don't really know who you are, or maybe have missed a backstory episode at some point in time, please take a minute to tell everybody who is the civilian rifleman.
yeah, so civilian rifleman was originally an idea I had back in 2020, kind of during that summer of love, 2020, 2021 time period.
Which is
And it was around that time that, I was noticing that a lot of the content that I was enjoying on YouTube, so T-Rex Arms, Grand Thumb, channels like that, I felt like there was kind of a gap in the teaching of just small unit tactics and strategy and things of that nature. And so I kind of got the idea of, maybe kind of putting a lot of the knowledge that I had attained over the years towards just teaching people how to, effectively be citizen soldiers. And so, because, for me, when, I look at firearm culture in the United States, I love looking at, a sexy looking gun and getting out to the range and doing all that stuff too. And I think that that's, really kind of the spirit of firearm ownership, in the United States. But, I have seen some writing on the wall over the last, 7, 8, 9 years, that, things are just kind of escalating here at home on the home front. There's a lot of political division and contention. And, I would rather be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war is, something that's always kind of stuck with me. So that's kind of where civilian rifleman, the idea came from. But, me, myself, I'm just a regular guy. I grew up playing, kind of just silly games on Xbox, I guess. But, Band of Brothers was a show I loved. Brothers in Arms was a game I played a lot on Xbox. There's another game, I can't remember the name of it, but a lot of these games kind of taught the basics of fire and maneuver, suppressive fire. Band of Brothers and Brothers in Arms got me into World War II, which got me into studying World War II, and then that just kind of cascaded into discovering the U.S. Army Publishing Directorate when I was pretty young. And, for the better part of the last, I don't know, 16, 17 years of my life, I've, my idea of a good time has been kind of cozying up on the couch on a Friday night and just kind of reading,
Mhm.
whatever it is, whether it's history, books on economics, military strategy, stuff like that. So, um, yeah, that's kind of that's civilian rifleman in a nutshell.
Well, awesome. So no prior service.
Nope. The closest I have is I was a firefighter for about 3 years. So I learned a lot about you know communication and medical and working with small teams, and there's a lot of ex-military there. And for some reason, I guess maybe it's just because it's what I've been interested in my whole life with military strategy and tactics. A lot of the friends and kind of peers that I have surrounded myself with have actually just kind of been ex-military. So,
Mhm.
it's no service on my end. I that's one of the reasons I called it civilian rifleman, is because I guess kind of what I wanted to encourage for folks is it's like if maybe you're getting a little bit older and you kind of missed your chance to actually serve, because that's kind of a big regret in my life, if I'm honest. But
Mhm.
if you kind of missed that opportunity, there's still the chance for you to be, a pillar of your community and your family that people can depend on. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah,
Well, I don't think it's always fair to say just because you weren't military you didn't serve. I mean, I'm both prior service, military, and a current fireman, and I would say those that work in law enforcement and the fire service. I mean, I still view that as service. There's more than one way to serve. So I'd always, for those that are listening and you're not prior military, but you're a first responder or something like that. I mean, it's still a service. So don't ever sell yourself short by any means.
yeah. Well, and I think that's very fair because, I mean, for me, when I started volunteering, it was, the whole point of it was that I wanted to kind of, serve my community. So I would certainly agree with that.
Sure. It's interesting that one of your name is civilian rifleman and kind of about where you get this idea of everything from this citizen soldier. There's been a lot of debate over probably the last 2 years as we're kind of in this weird in between place of the tactical American, the everyday citizen tactical individual, and it basically goes you can either be a combative or a civilian, but you can't be both.
Mm,
Um, and some people say, well, that's not fair because American culture, through history, has always been the citizen soldier more so than almost anywhere else in recent history, let alone the last couple thousand years. I mean, the citizen soldier days of specifically Greece, Sparta, stuff like that. Some of the other Euro nations, the citizen soldier idea has kind of gone away. You're either one or the other. But
mm.
America is very unique with its culture.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that it is kind of deeply ingrained in American culture. I mean, certainly not the stuff that's taught in school and whatnot, but when you look back on the history of our country and the way it was founded and the sacrifices that just common, average, everyday, men made,
Mhm.
almost 250 years ago. I mean, these were guys that, it's easy today in the life that a lot of us live in, a house with electricity and air conditioning and heat and plumbing. It's easy to kind of take that concept and say, well, they were farmers back then, but then they went out and fought. But,
Mhm.
it would have been really difficult back then because, I mean, you didn't have any of the luxuries that we enjoy today. And so, being a simple farmer was, I mean, your chief concern would be, am I going to be able to grow enough food to make it through the winter? And am I going to be able to, support my family through this? So the sacrifice those
Mhm.
guys made was immense. And, I think that for kind of the modern citizen, just kind of being in touch with, I don't know, I guess just kind of that spirit of self
Mhm.
reliance and, just kind of being just sufficient in, even just being able to navigate by land with, a compass and a map is, it's kind of a lost art. And so I think it's kind of important for people to, just get in touch with that stuff, I guess.
It's interesting you bring up, the founders and their ideas and, all of the history from 250 years ago. This is something I've talked about a lot with people recently. I'd be interested to hear your opinion on it. And our opinions only carry so much weight, which is which is not that much in the grand scheme of
Yeah.
things. So we're just internet people. But there's been a lot of debate recently over the interpretation and maybe more so limitations of certain aspects of the Second Amendment, as it always has been throughout history. Less so the last part, the right to keep bear arms, shall not be infringed, so on and so forth, but more so about the militia side of things. And obviously, as we've moved past 2020, we see a lot more community groups organizing, both from like the mutual assistance group sides to the more formal like response group sides, the Minuteman groups, even the niche word of militias. A lot of people stay away from the word militia just because it's kind of been soured wrongly by the media.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to call it what it is. It's kind of what it is. So the question kind of begs right now is, where does the authority of the right of the people to organize and train truly lie based on what our founding fathers believed? Because for those that don't know that are listening, in all 50 states, non-state recognized governor controlled militias are illegal in every single way. Essentially, in most states, you either have the National Guard, and in some states, you also have the State Defense Force, which is kind of like a backstep from the National Guard. Backstep sounds bad, but it's a different side of the house. So that would mean any county recognized militia or a regional based militia or a township based militia, and there are places all throughout the country who have these, is technically illegal. But the courts and the state and the communities and everything, they don't fight about it because it's not worth it right now. Or maybe the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But this is coming up a lot more right now because in Virginia, obviously, there was a big swing in the election recently.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of 2A legislation coming down. Well, Virginia is home to one of the largest groups of constitutional militias in the country. And what I mean by constitutional militia is they have county recognized and based militias that are sponsored by the county. It's in their chart. It's passed by the county board. You guys are recognized. You guys are supported. You guys are funded. You guys are blah, blah, blah by the county. Now, according to Virginia state law, that's technically illegal. But the county said, hey, we passed it. It's legal by our standards. So the general question right now is, where does the authority to organize and train lie? Obviously, we can get into crazy semantics about where your authority lies in the response perspective, but the simple act of organizing and responding, where does it lie? Does it lie within the people itself? Is it at the county level? Because militias were always organized by county, before, during, and after the American Revolution. Does it lie at the state level? Or is, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's I've always been of the opinion that we are not beholden to our government. Our government is beholden to us, and it's a lot of what you're talking about. Honestly, it kind of reminds me of Ukraine just a few years ago, where firearm ownership was not really something that was easy to come by for just the average civilian, and they were kind of negative on that whole idea leading up to the conflict with Russia, and then all of a sudden, at the drop of the hat, what did they do? They started having militias popping up all over the place. So, I think here at home, again just kind of taking more of a historic look at it. The 13 colonies, they did have the Continental Army, but for the most part, the vast majority of their fighting force were militias, and George Washington quite famously was not really a fan of militias because they were very difficult to manage. But I think that just generally, I don't feel that it's the place of anyone in a position of power or authority in government to go to their constituents or their people and effectively say you do not have the right to organize to protect yourselves or your communities. I think that that is something that if the individual is interested in doing that, provided that their motivations for doing so are, I'll say honorable, then, they have, in my opinion, they should have the full right to do so. I think that, if we start looking at, groups wanting to organize to maybe stir up problems or, do bad things, obviously, I don't think that that's a good idea. Because a lot of the things that I teach is just more so preparedness and everything. So it's just kind of that
Sure.
desire to, just kind of be in a little more control and, kind of be that pillar in your community and everything. But when it comes to, the mutual assistance groups or, whatever you want to call it, um, I think that that's entirely up to, kind of smaller levels of government, or at least it should be.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important to make a distinction between MAGs and militias and or community response groups. Because MAGs are by default normally going to be much smaller. They do not have an outward mission of community influence, community responsibility, so on and so forth, where the other side of the house, they are looking to grow their infrastructure and influence in service of the greater community without, the thought of anything in return per se. So it is important that we keep those two things distinctive when we're trying to figure out like where is the place of everybody. There are some writings from the founding fathers that place this idea in different places. Some were very big proponents of state-run militias. The militia is run by the state-level entity, and obviously the governor would be the ultimate authority in that manner. But the big underlying principle of a lot of those things is that at the local level, it was still the responsibility of the locals to maintain good order and discipline amongst the militia. It wasn't a free for all at the lower level, but it also wasn't under the complete thumb of the state government, which then leads to some quotes from others that basically said it is the state's responsibility to train the citizenry that will serve in the militia and provide good order and structure. So then the greater question becomes, if the state, and the state could mean the literal states or just, government in general, if a level of the state does not provide the citizenry with good order, discipline, and training and structure, really, morally speaking, it becomes a burden of the people to ensure that there is good order and discipline. Because again, like what we said, we don't want militias just stirring up trouble and basically making it free for all and making it a warlord society. But I mean, I am a very big firm believer that communities and or to regions and or to states should have multiple levels of, fighting options per se, but that comes with a level of professionalism and responsibility as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, with everything that I had previously said on the subject too, I mean, I still have a great deal of respect for our National Guard, because in a lot of ways, the modern context of what the National Guard is, that is really the state level militia. So, I think the question kind of comes down to county level stuff, small towns. And how do people want to organize on those levels? And I think to your previous point about Virginia and how if you did want to organize on kind of that more local, smaller scale level, that would technically be considered illegal. And I think that really a lot of this stuff comes down to the shoulders of the local sheriff in most places on kind of a smaller level, because I mean, I know there's been what I would argue as pretty unconstitutional anti-Second Amendment laws that have passed pretty much all over the country over the last 10, 20 years or so, that have just slowly infringed more and more and more and more. And it a lot of the times it's not uncommon for you to read a story about how the local sheriff says, yeah, we saw that the state just passed that, we're not going to enforce it. So it really just kind of boils down to the local level, and I mean, I'll say it, I guess, kind of to some degree, backbone.
Mm-hmm. And that backbone also Again, from a professional and responsible perspective, a strong either militia presence or community response group presence, whatever title we're throwing on these things, a strong citizen soldier corps may give a sheriff and or the locally affected elected officials even more of a platform and strong place to stand on and say, hey, we're not going to do these things that we think is wrong, because the sheriff knows it's not just him and 4 or 5 deputies. It's him and 40 or 50 well-trained, well-organized, well-disciplined guys that have his back, and vice versa. And if you stand up for them, they'll stand up for you. And I think there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that it's one of the things, I encourage folks all the time, go volunteer, with your local fire department, or if you can, go see if you can volunteer or help out around, your local sheriff's office too. I mean, at the end of the day, these guys have hard jobs, and I mean, if you go and kind of express your interest on what you're interested in doing, I'd be cautious with how you approach that conversation. Maybe, get to know them first. But, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, it's one of those relationships that, it pays dividends just kind of getting to know folks in law enforcement and, your local fire department. You'll learn a ton of skills and everything that will benefit you throughout the rest of your life. And, yeah, I mean, there's definitely kind of that self-protection, self-preservation, caveat to it as well, which just makes it more beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And really, at the end of the day, I mean, building the relationships at the community level expands far beyond just your sheriff or a local fire department or anything like that. I mean, it's everywhere. It's with, your churches or other religious institutions. It is, the small business owners. It's your neighbors. It's everybody. What are people going to say about you on the day of whatever happens? Are they going to be like, that was a good guy in the community, that was a well morally founded guy? Or they be like, that guy was a whack job and that guy was rude, and whatever happens to him happens to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm even, I'm a big advocate of men's groups and everything too, just to, I mean, if there's not one, because I live pretty rural. I'm in a small community, and I've been kind of bouncing the idea around of getting one started, and not even just for, a preparedness side of things, but I mean, even just for, just kind of getting a little more involved in my community than, I have been for, the last year or so, because, had a recent move and everything and been super focused on starting a new business. But, I mean, I think even just something simple like that, I mean, it's a great place to start. And I think that, when I kind of observe, the community at large, because I've made videos on, how do you approach, your neighbors to start a mutual assistance group and all this stuff. And, there's, I think a lot of guys out there that kind of struggle to do that. And I think that I mean, at least to some degree, I think for a lot of guys, it's kind of in our nature to be, maybe a little more reserved and a little more quiet, and not as much of, kind of the community builders. And I think that that's something that's really kind of missing from, this community of, preparedness and, just kind of forward thinking, safety, security, things like that. That community generally, I think, is kind of missing the understanding of, how to go and reach out and build, a robust and kind of bigger community to, just folks you can depend on. And it doesn't have to be for sleeper cells or, for anything crazy. It could be for a power outage. I mean, it's anything.
And men, more specifically than women, really require, especially in young men, require good social pressure to be better men.
Mm-hmm.
Men can very easily be kind of swayed outside of what we would probably consider a morally well-founded man for our society. And that's a very loaded question, because you could probably ask 100 different men what makes a good man, and they're all going to have different opinions.
Yeah.
And then if you ask 100 men from each side of the political aisle, you're going to have 1,000 different opinions. So There is some difference in that, but men in general need good social pressure from other men to be better men. You have to surround yourself with good influences. It's kind of, I've heard it commonly said that women want to be a good woman to a man because of how a man is to her, but men want to be good men even more so to live up to other men's expectations in a sense. Like if you have a bad father figure, more than likely you're going to struggle in growing as a man until somebody kind of course corrects you in a sense. And that's why it's so hard for so many people to get out of bad situations, bad neighborhoods, so on and so forth. They have these generational problems because they don't have anybody to pull them out. Some guys go off and join the military. Sometimes that fixes the problem, not always. But those that grow up with good father figures normally go on to be good father figures themselves or are a good example for other men on how to carry themselves forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's and I'm gonna paraphrase this quote a little bit, but there was a quote from Ben Franklin where he talked about the idea of, and I mean, Ben Franklin was genuinely a fairly brilliant man when we look back historically, but he was always of the opinion that if he walked into a room, his hope, what he kind of aspired for, was to be the dumbest person in that room. Because when you surround yourself with people that are, stronger, smarter, however you want to quantify what better means, whatever it is that you kind of respect, when you think about what does it mean to be a good man, whatever that value is, you should surround yourself with people that embody that, and people that almost just kind of lead the way and teach you how to do that, because it kind of becomes the foundation for who you are. And I feel quite blessed. I have a good relationship with my father, and I've had, just being honest with you, I've probably had, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 different men in my life that I would consider to be fatherly figures, that have really, kind of taught me a lot. And yeah, it's so important for young men.
One thing I did want to kind of touch back on, I didn't want to interrupt the conversation. Something you said before, we're talking about, all of the gun laws that seem to seemingly keep getting passed down throughout the entire United States. We bring up Virginia specifically just because they're kind of in a hole right now. But in general, the Second Amendment is very confusing right now as far as what is its status in the country. Because on one hand, you would say there's a lot of limitations depending on where you live. There's more laws being passed down every day. We're not really getting the overturns at the federal level that you would think we would be getting. But on the other side of the aisle, the fact that we're even talking about some of this at the federal level, and we're talking about removing the 1991, machine gun ban, and we removed taxes from suppressors, and now it's really just kind of a registry, which is a problem within itself. But we're there. We went from auto rifles in 2022 to now we're in belt feds in 2026. I actually just got my Recce RPD from Red Right Hand in the mail today, and I put it together. That's fantastic.
Nice.
And we see stuff from like IWA and the bangers and the smokes and the door charges for Minecraft purposes, and now we're looking at like OC and stuff and 37 mil. And you see just all of these different companies that make uniforms and camouflage and equipment and so on and so forth. So it's a very weird place to be, where it's like, is the Second Amendment doing bad or good? It's a very weird place to be at right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and it's it's kind of a tough, juggling act between federal and state law. And I think when we look back historically throughout the United States' history, it's kind of it's been a very prominent challenge that this country's faced for, the better part of about 200 years of its history, where states want the right to, effectively govern themselves, to some degree. And, the federal government is going to kind of always try to, stretch the envelope a little bit more and kind of, pass more laws. I mean, I wouldn't even begin to know how many new laws get passed in this country on an annual basis, but be willing to bet it's, you know,
It's a lot.
hundreds probably, and if not thousands.
Higher. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, I mean, you look back through history, and I mean, I'm more so just a student of the Civil War. I try to kind of stem away from, providing too many opinions on that stuff. I like people to kind of think for themselves. But like the whole idea of the Civil War with the South, confederalism, the Confederate Army. If you actually go look up the definition of confederalism, it's effectively the idea that states want to govern themselves. Obviously, when I talk about the Civil War, I'm not advocating for slavery or anything like that. I'm glad that we got rid of that. But when you look at the definition of the word of confederalism, it's very interesting in today's context because in a lot of ways, states are kind of getting more power to govern themselves, and it's kind of fascinating looking back to the American Civil War and just kind of the whole idea of what confederalism really was like at its core, and then seeing the parallels between the definition of that word and then just what's going on a state to state level basis now from you know some pretty touchy subjects for a lot of folks, but gun laws, abortion rights, all that stuff. I mean, even drug paraphernalia is different, vastly different in Tennessee than it is in Washington or Oregon.
Sure.
And so yeah, it's very interesting when you kind of start looking back and peeling back the layers on a lot of our history, just kind of seeing I don't know, I guess just the direction we're going.
It's very interesting that you bring up, all of that different stuff. Gun rights, abortion, drug paraphernalia, tax code, building code. Like the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest things I feel like we struggle with right now, and I really try to bring people around to this way of thinking, is that we have got to get past this idea that one day we are all going to agree about everything in every manner all of the time. Like people kind of think that we're having a problem getting people to be a unified voice for a reason. And I would say the left probably has the same problem as the right does right now, and the center, and so on and so forth, is that generally speaking, within your political party, you probably agree with about 90% of the same stuff. Maybe 95% if we're saying the same stuff with a few caveats. Everybody on the right has a pretty good agreement of what firearms are. And then it kind of differs on abortion. Then it kind of differs on taxes. Then it kind of differs on foreign policy. And I think the biggest thing we struggle with is people are just not willing to take the wins and say, hey, here's a good firm base that we agree on. And they're just so focused on the negatives. Like, let's take the abortion crowd, for example. We're going to get controversial here, just saying that word. There's a lot of people on the right that they kind of fit into two crowds. Abortion should be illegal, outright, none of it. It's never acceptable. And then there's like a small margin of people that say it's not even acceptable for life-saving care for, a mother, like a ectopic pregnancy or something, which was a really weird thing that I learned about 2 years ago that I still have not wrapped my head around.
Yeah.
And then you have the rest of the right that's like, hey, abortion seems wrong 99% of the time. But, teenage girls or very young girls that are raped seems acceptable. And then the two crowds just go at each other's throats, even though that they agree that 99% of that abortion is wrong. And then you could probably find the same exact topics and the same exact reasons and the same exact concept when you go to the Democrat side of the aisle, between more center-of-the-line Democrats and then even all the way to the far left. And I don't know why that is and how we got here.
Yeah, well, and I think that's really one of the, that's one of the biggest problems in the U.S. now. And, I tend to be a fairly conservative dude. A few libertarian values I'll throw in there. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also live in a fairly blue state, and so a lot of my buddies and friends and family that I've grown up around have been either fairly blue or extremely blue. And it's just, as time has gone on, I can even remember a difference from, 20 years ago, just in the dialogue that people, used to have. And I think that the single biggest issue that has kind of driven this over the last 2 decades is social media. Because, when you look at the way that these algorithms are built on any social media that you use, it really does create an echo chamber because those algorithms are so good at learning exactly what you believe and exactly where you stand. I think it was Facebook actually a few years ago. They said that they had gotten their algorithm to a point where it was so good that it knew what time of the day you were using the bathroom. And so these algorithms are so advanced that they can spoon feed you exactly, what's going to kind of reinforce your worldview. And I think that that's one of the biggest problems that we have, not only on the right and within the right, but also on the left and within the left. And then, when you put those two groups together, everyone's just kind of existing in their own echo chamber where they're getting reinforced all of these ideas. And so, somebody on the far left is, they're getting their information from, their community of 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 other people, and they're all affirming their beliefs. And then you get somebody who's on the far right and they're getting the same thing. And then you put those two people in the same room together and they just cannot even have a dialogue because their worldviews have been affirmed to them by, hundreds or thousands of other people. And, there's just no persuading, them that, I don't know, I guess just kind of consider something slightly different maybe. And, I got some other opinions on that to go a little bit deeper that, I think that, I think that there's probably a tendency for, some folks to maybe be a little bit better at, considering other ideas. But it's kind of apples to apples anyway. It doesn't really matter much.
Sure.
And doesn't really solve the problem either. So,
Well, it's a very interesting psychological question to ask about social media and social media algorithms. I would imagine that years from now, the same way that probably part of the listeners that are listening right now or your parents discussed world before internet. We're talking there was internet in the 90s, but not how we know it now. Even the internet from the early 2000s is completely different than now. But we talk about everything from the 90s going back, and then probably a certain point in the future moving forward, where this entire span of history will be discussed for generations and how it changed everything for better or for worse. I guess how everything works out, probably a decade or so from now is probably going to decide a lot of that if we have that long.
yeah.
We might live in a Dune universe eventually. We're kind of on track for that whole movie scheme. But there's a very interesting psychological question that comes with all of this, and you're talking about reinforcing worldviews or maybe moral beliefs or just whatever it might be, because there's some things that I cannot wrap my head around as we live in an American society that as of until about 10 years ago still had some level of what is really considered, of what is supposed to be considered morally right and not right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll use a specific example. Recently, there was an incident where a young teenage girl, I can't remember how old she was, somewhere between 12 to 15, I think. She was assaulted by 3 boys at school who were also young teenagers, I think 13 to 16, somewhere in that range. Race and where it was I won't even bring it up because it shouldn't even matter. However, in this instance, the 3 boys held down this girl, and when the girl started to scream, one of the boys shoved rocks in the girl's mouth, and they proceeded to assault and sexually assault her and so on and so forth. And after this whole incident came to light in the media, the father of the young boy who put rocks in the girl's mouth as she screamed to quiet her made his case to the media that it's not his son's fault, and he just got wrapped up in a bad crowd of other boys, and that we're blowing this out of proportion. And it's things to that degree, which people might say that's a pretty extreme degree, but that's the standard now. We've now set the standard. That gentleman, in his complete denial of responsibility for himself and his son, have set the standard. And that is a really broken and weird place to try and find your way back from as a society.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's one of those things where if you stand for nothing, you'll kneel for anything. And I think that there's a lot of folks today just my personal belief is that it's a byproduct of the comfortable lifestyle that, a lot of us live, where I don't think that a lot of people are willing to kind of draw a line in the sand and just really speak up and defend their beliefs and, do so in a, cordial manner. And I think that, we are now culturally and societally, with the example that you just raised, unfortunately, there's a lot of examples like that. And we find ourselves in a situation now where for the better part of, the last 20 years, a lot of folks around the country have just they've just kind of said, well, we'll give up some ground on that one. And, we'll let them have that one because it's not that bad. And I hate to use the slippery slope example because I think that it's kind of an overused analogy, but I mean, there are a lot of issues that, if you give up ground, you give up an inch, they will take a mile. And I think realistically for most issues, probably somewhere in the middle. I think probably both parties should end up feeling like they left the conversation or they left the deal, maybe didn't get everything that they wanted out of it. So, somewhere in the middle is probably, a decent place to be on a lot of things. But, man, you got to be able to, I mean, talk about backbone. You got to be able to, I'm not going to say burn bridges or anything, but I mean, you need to be able to just kind of convey your beliefs in a succinct and coherent way. And, I think just kind of touching on social media again, too, I think this is just another big problem is, a lot of social media just, it kind of almost tells you what to think. There's not really a lot of, questioning that goes on in a lot of social media. It's just, hey, here are, my facts, and I'm going to push them on you. And then people just kind of adopt them as their own beliefs and their own facts. And I think that this is something where, if we go back, not even that long ago, I mean, if we go back, 50 years ago, 80 years ago, people read a lot of books. And I think that that's why podcasts like this, in general, are just becoming so much more popular in the last 10 years is because just listening to a conversation and listening to people share ideas, it's kind of reminiscent of the same experience that you get from reading a book where, that book is not necessarily going to tell you what to think or what to believe. It's just going to present ideas for you to kind of digest and sit on and think about. And we don't get a lot of that anymore.
Well, we've lost a lot of civility in our society as a whole. And I feel like really it's kind of a downfall of the Western world as a whole at this point, where one side is kind of just pushing one side further and further until eventually their back's going to hit the wall. And you're right, the podcast setting provides a great kind of platform for people to speak, but people to conversate like this. And I think I personally have a very good ability to conversate with people who think differently than me in real life. I can't really think of any times where shouting and whatnot has come into play, even if we're just completely different ideals. Because if you engage in dialogue and you keep that level of civility and common respect amongst each other, it goes a really, really long way. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to change people's minds just because you're nice to them and you know how to talk well. But if we can at least get back to the general point of probably American society where we can have dialogue, there might be hope. But unfortunately, I think we're kind of far past dialogue. We're in a weird middle ground of what's going on here.
Yeah, well, and I think that's fair up to a point because I mean I mentioned earlier, I'm a fairly conservative guy living in a fairly blue state, and I would argue that the vast majority of conversations that I have with folks, at the end of the day, honestly, I'm on the right, my buddy's on the left. We kind of agree that there's a problem on X issue. The thing we don't agree on is how to get there. And
Mm-hmm.
we can kind of have a conversation and have a discourse about that, but the problem really comes in from kind of these more fringe elements, which I would argue makes up a disproportionately small percent of the population. I don't think I would say that it's probably more than maybe 10% of our population are just so, just so deep into their own beliefs that they're just incapable of,
Mm-hmm.
um, even kind of hearing a different argument without, getting upset or, whatever. But, um, yeah, I mean, it's just, it's kind of one of those times in history where we're just going to have to kind of see how it plays out, because the other unfortunate thing about, even though it is what I would argue is a fairly small percent of the population that is just kind of incapable of engaging in a discourse. I mean, in a country of 350 million people, it doesn't take a lot of people for things to escalate, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Which,
it's interesting because really, outside of really 5 countries in the world, there's no countries comparative in size to the United States. You have India at 1.7 billion. You have China at 1.3 million. The United States is next at 350 million, probably closer to 390 million
mhm,
if you consider illegals
yep, yep,
and various forms of legal immigrants that are not citizens. Then you have Russia sitting at, really, I don't know where it's sitting at now
yeah,
because so many of them have died in Europe, but
yeah.
150 million plus. And then you have Iran at 93 million.
Oh, is it up
The
to
rest of the,
93? Okay.
oh yeah, Iran's a big country. And then it gets smaller from there. And I think that's something we forget about a lot is that it's hard to keep that many people on the same ideal system of morality, of literally anything. It could be anything. You're not going to get 350 million people to agree on how tax dollars should be used, let alone how much taxes should be. I mean, if you look at India, India's a country, kind of. I mean, there's more religious groups and community segregation groups and races of people in India than almost anywhere on the planet. And really, if it wasn't for Britain, making them be a country, I don't know if India would be what India is. China is a straight dictatorship.
Yeah.
Russia's always just been Russia. They're just really big. And then you have Iran. Iran is a uh, theological dictatorship run by, Islam. But at the same time, there's still an entire area of Kurdistan that makes up northern Iran, that connects to northern Iraq and southern Turkey and so on and so forth. So even all of Iran isn't necessarily unified. Um,
Yeah.
it's really kind of a miracle that the United States is what it is and not like any of the other people I just described.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is. And it's, it's one of the reasons I really do, I love our country very much. And, I love a lot of aspects of our history. And, I kind of love that idea of the American dream. And, um, I don't know, man. It's, it's, it's pretty amazing that we have what we have, but I think it is in large part, just kind of everything that you just mentioned. It is difficult to keep, everybody kind of under the same roof, and everybody's kind of got the same understanding. And I do think that this is kind of that component of why we're seeing a little bit of fracturing and why we're hearing conversations around balkanization and things like that. Because I mean, the reality is, I mean, if you go to Texas and you spend a month in Texas and then you go spend a month in California, it is going to feel like you are in two different countries. And I mean, we're under the same roof. We're all Americans and everything, but I mean, there's some pretty profound differences these days.
You
And
could you could spend a month in two different places in Texas and still think you're in different countries. And the same goes for California.
yeah, that's true. That is true.
It's very interesting because you said something earlier about we all agree that there is a problem. The problem really lies in that we don't agree in the same solution to the problem.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't really know how you find a pathway forward with that.
Yeah.
Because everybody's right in their own book. I mean, if you look at the people who kind of find themselves on the more um, conservative slash libertarian right, the majority of which is Christian, morally based, with some. I always give them a shout out. Kind of the Norse pagans are kind of wrapped in there in a tight part of Christian history in there.
That's true.
And they share the modern day Norse pagans share a lot of the same moral principles. So I definitely try to not make things all about just Christian theocracy. As grand as that sounds, maybe in my mind, I try to remember the true principles of freedom our country was founded on. And then you go to the left side, and you're getting away from the capitalism. You're getting away from probably some level of a moral foundation that religion brings, and you start exploring a little bit more of socialism. You go even further left, you get to a weird place of communism. So how do you bring those two different people together and say, here's the better solution for everybody moving forward? Because at this point, I really don't know how that happens.
Yeah, and I mean that is especially if we look back over the last 100 years of communist revolutions in Russia, in China, in Vietnam,
Vietnam.
North Korea, all of these kind of communist revolutions. And I'm going to kind of table that for a second and just train hop just a little bit. But
Sure.
when we kind of look back over the last several thousand years of human history, in almost every culture around the world, there's always a religion. And that religion effectively teaches, morality and ethics. Doesn't matter what religion it is. Doesn't matter if it's Norse paganism or Christianity or, Sikhism or Hinduism or whatever. All of these religions all effectively teach, the people that practice those religions what is right and wrong, what is moral, what is ethical. And I think that the bigger thing to consider when we look back over thousands of years of just human religious practice is that to some degree, I think that the pursuit of religion, the pursuit of figuring out why we're here, figuring out, God and all of this different stuff is kind of ingrained in us as people. And so to go now back to, communism and socialism, these are political ideologies that do everything they can to abolish religion. And so this human desire to have religion that is ingrained in us from thousands of years, it has to be replaced by something. And so if communism and socialism wants to replace religion, they have to replace it with government. They have to replace it with environmentalism. They have to replace it with all of these different things. And government and environmentalism and all of these different things, they don't teach right and wrong. They don't teach what is moral and what is ethical. They, in many cases, teach, self-interest or, oh gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't think of it. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't really teach, the things that we get from any religion, really. So
No, I mean that's very true. A lot of people would say that really the downfall of the West has been the movement away from religion, whatever that religion may be. The majority of it is Christianity. A lot of
Mhm.
people would say the downfall of it is the movement away from religion. And if it's not necessarily the movement away from religion, it's the movement away from those, those moral foundations of what is right and wrong away. You could probably see it a lot from like the 60s to the 90s. You kind of see the whole hippie rebellious movement
Mhm.
amongst probably many of our parents' generation. Depending on how young you are listening to this, your grandparents' generation. Um, but there definitely was a movement away from, a more dedicated and serious religious aspect of society at that point. But everybody still lived within somewhat the moral foundations of what religion was trying to establish. But eventually you get too far outside of that, and we get to my example earlier of putting rocks in little girls' mouths, and it's a weird place to be.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Again, how do you bring everybody back to a middle ground?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I wish, you know, I wish I had the answer, and I wish even if I did, anybody'd listen. But
Yeah, we're just internet people
yeah. But
at the end of the day.
yeah, and I mean, man, that's kind of the big question, and I think that that's really the thing that people are struggling with. I mean, I think that probably the single biggest factor, it really does just come down to the individual. And even as somebody that is trying to build a brand on the internet and in large part on social medias, I think realistically, if we want to really try to fix a lot of the cultural and societal problems that we have, I mean, the answer really is get off social media, man. Go outside, go for a hike, go learn a skill, go,
Yeah.
go volunteer with your fire department. That was one of the most profound things and experiences I've ever done in my life. I learned a lot. I met wonderful people, and I saw tragedy. And all of those things, shaped who I am now. And, you know, God willing, someday I'll be a father. And, a lot of those lessons can, you know, I don't know, maybe I can impart some of them on a little me. And yeah, just try to make the world a little bit better of a place, just one kid at a time.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. I mean, at least for the male listeners, I'm not female, so I can't give too much womanly advice. But men benefit from being surrounded by other good men.
Yeah. Yep. It's absolutely true. And yeah, I really I can't plug the idea of volunteering with a group like that enough, because it's
Mm.
man, just I some of the best memories I have are from that. So
So, with all of this being said, we've definitely gone into way deeper of conversations than I thought we were going to discuss. It's just where the
yeah.
conversation had taken us. Um, Going back to the civilian rifleman, or what I commonly refer to as the American rifleman, because I like to think of it as a very historically American trait that we have as a society.
Yeah.
What does the citizen soldier, what does the American rifleman do with all this information we just gave them? I mean, what is the pathway forward? What advice do you have to them?
I mean, I think that for, just kind of the average guy, just like me, it's just read. And actually I'll put one before read. Exercise, work out, be
Oh, so
healthy.
so big.
And I think that somebody told me something years ago that always stuck with me, which is that when you look at someone that you respect, you should, in a lot of ways, try to embody that person. You should try to become a man that you respect. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier of, kind of surround yourself with people that you respect. But I mean, really, at the end of the day, for you or for me or for anybody else out there, all that we can really influence and impact at the end of the day is ourselves. And
Hmm.
one of the gifts that we have in being able to, change ourselves and make ourselves better is that has an impact that cascades to the people around us. So if your friends and your family see that you're, getting in better shape and you're reading more books. All of a sudden, you know a lot of new random things that come up in conversation. These things have an impact on other people and it cascades out and it improves, not only the quality of your own life, but of the people around you. And, when we look at all the societal and cultural problems that we have, unless AI just has some crazy idea and just fixes everything, which I don't think that's going to happen, uh, since, it's just a computer. But, at the end of the day, it really does just come down to, human interaction and developing yourself. And that's really the only way to fix a society. And it does not happen overnight. I mean, the situation that we find ourselves in with all of the political division and just kind of inability to engage in dialogue, I mean, these are problems that are going to, I mean, realistically, when we look back on history, they're going to take decades to fix. I mean, a lot of these, rebellions and wars that occurred in, ancient China. I am fascinated by ancient China and just all the conflicts that they had. But I mean, a lot of those wars lasted for, 60 years, 100 years. And, a lot of their societal and cultural problems lasted for, 80 years. And, there's no quick way out of this. There's no quick fix. But, as an individual, you can impact the people around you just a little bit each day. That's what really matters. That's what makes an impact.
That was very well said.
Thank you.
What would you say either from a teaching perspective, product perspective, training perspective, whatever it might be, what would you say the civilian defense industry as a whole lacks the most right now?
Mm. I've been seeing a little bit more of this in the last couple of years. But I would say really it's more so on the technology side. So I was actually deep, deep in the rabbit hole on the internet, and was exploring a GitHub repository the other day of an open source, effectively code to build your own radar system. So, you can see things that are about 20 miles out. And the technology side for, secure communications, or, just the technologies that just the average citizen really lacks, is kind of a big pitfall because, I mean, there's a ton of phenomenal plate carriers and rifles and, radios and all this stuff that, you can pick up and kind of get all that stuff. But, and I guess kind of to segue off of the technology side, I'd also mention, the establishment of, like kind of defensive contracting LLCs where, maybe a group of 20 like-minded individuals starts a company so that they can get into a certain sector and, buy armored vehicles or, whatever as a company. That's kind of that organized side that's missing. And, the third thing, I guess, is really just kind of that broader community, not kind of the superficial like social media one where it's like, I got 1 million followers, like we're a big community. It's like, no, like you have 10 buddies that, like, if the going gets really tough, it's like if the grocery store's empty, like who knows how to have a garden or, whatever. So it's also just kind of the community and a diverse range of skills.
My biggest thing I think it lacks right now, and this is a hard one because there is such a thing as control of information. And it's part of a reason I have slowed down on some of my content recently, because I've gotten to the point where, I mean, after 6 years of YouTube and social media and whatnot, I feel like I've discussed all of the basics enough. And there's a lot of people that discuss the basics much better than I do, or have better editing, whatever it might be. There is a higher level of structural organizing and kind of the command and control essence of things. And I think what really goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the the organized aspect of this 2A movement we kind of find ourselves in, I think there's a really large lack of training for a lot of that. I just don't know how you address it because you can't really do it online because you don't want just you don't want just anybody to have that information. But those types of like trainings to put on physically require a lot of resources, and I'm sure it would not be expensive to put on. I've looked into it; it's not cheap.
Yeah.
So then you're kind of removing a large demographic, perhaps, of the whole community that might be interested in it. Um,
Yeah.
and maybe that's just me because I see the professionalism side of things as just one of the most important things. It's got to be professional. I talked about it when I went on the Longhouse podcast recently, and Geo brought it up. I think it was Geo. It was Geo or one of the other guys, and they were talking about the U.S. military is the best military in the world because of bureaucracy, because it has SOGs and doctrine and writing and standards and schools for literally everything. There is doctrine on how to write doctrine, what font you're supposed to use, what size it's supposed to be, and what part of the like it's all there. And I feel like from the organized civilian perspective, kind of the more organized, grander scheme of the American Rifleman, there has to be some of that. I just don't know how to do it from an OPSEC perspective because I wouldn't want. I'd be very blunt and honest. I have zero desire to train elements of Antifa or John Brown gun clubs or people that might be here illegally and are part of other foreign assets, like whatever it might be. I have zero desire to give them any edge. So I don't really know how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it's one that I have juggled with a fair bit, if I'm honest. Just by the nature of my content. And I mean, from like an OPSEC side, and how are you going to disseminate that information and things like that? I think that the logic, if you will, I guess that I've come to the conclusion of that makes me feel a little bit better about it is just the 80-20 rule. So who's the 80% that's watching my channel? Who's the 20? And it's I think that the vast majority of people that kind of watch my content on a lot of strategy and tactics and doctrine and things like that, I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the vast majority of them are just good people that are interested in learning this stuff for a variety of different reasons. Probably just to want to be a better protector or be a pillar of their community, whatever it is. But the other side of that is just kind of the element of you don't want the wrong people stumbling across that information, but it's also kind of all available online. I mean, really all I effectively do for any of my content really is just kind of effectively I write out a script on some doctrine that I want to cover, and all the doctrine is it's already available on the internet if you know where to look. So
sure. And there is a plethora of doctrine. You could find damn near the whole O3 infantry school, Marine Corps infantry school, just on the internet.
Yeah. Yep. And that's I kind of mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast, but I mean that was kind of my idea of a good time when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. I didn't really go out and party. I just kind of I'd literally print off a field manual and just read it. And I'd kind of a weirdo, I guess, but
yeah, that's okay. And really the other thing at the end of the day is we need people who do have experience with the capabilities for leadership to take on leadership roles, whether they want to or not.
It's just, and I think that's really important too, because, and I'm not like trying to toot my own horn here or anything, but I just, over my life with, athletics and sports and, work and all these different things, like I always just kind of managed to end up in a leadership role. And the funny thing is I never actually really wanted it. Like it just kind of fell on me. And I think that that's probably one of the most important things of what you said is even if you don't want it, because the reality is that if you're taking care of yourself and you're exercising and you're reading, you're making yourself better each and every day. I mean, you kind of owe it to the people around you, to fall into some kind of leadership role, even if it's just something like, yeah, if you're CPR certified, and it's like, if you want to take that extra step to go and put on a course and teach people how to do it in your local community. I mean, whatever it is,
Mhm.
you kind of owe it not only to yourself, but to the people around you. Because it's like I went through fire academy and then volunteered for a couple of years, and I don't know if I'd say it's fortunate or unfortunate, but I've actually been first on scene for, I think, maybe 3 accidents in the last year and a half, and a couple of them were pretty bad. And I was glad that I had that knowledge to know what to do. And that's uh, I should probably hit on medical a little bit more on my channel, but at the same time, there's some compliance and stuff like that on what you can actually do. So,
Mhm. One last thing I'd like to get your opinion on, since it's a hot topic right now, and you've discussed it a little bit on your channel. Um, let's talk about the conflict in the Middle East.
mm,
Uh, Again, we're
yes.
just we're just we're just internet people, but we're allowed to have opinions. Um,
Fair enough.
we are. Let's see. Today's date of recording is March 18th, so we are 19 days U.S. time. Really, I think we're really closer to 20 at this point if you're considering local time
Hmm.
to the theater. We're 20 days into this conflict at this point. What is your general analysis? What's a general unbiased opinion you might have at this point, or maybe even a biased opinion? But your professional. I guess we can't say professional because
My
what's your internet person perspective?
I'll say, so I think that there's been a fair bit of rhetoric about how quick the conflict's going to be.
Mhm.
Um, and you said it earlier, Iran is a very large country.
Very large,
The
huge.
the southeast is effectively a desert. The southeast and east of Tehran is a desert, which is extremely difficult for logistics. The north and west are just brutally mountainous. It's actually quite beautiful country. If you just go look up like some drone footage, I was doing that for one of my videos recently. But it's extremely mountainous, and mountainous terrain favors insurgency. And so I think that the ambition with this entire conflict was to kind of try to pull off something like what we did in Venezuela. And I think that the underlying motivation was to strip China of its allies, because the fewer allies China has, the more that China is going to struggle when the day comes that they decide to act on Taiwan, which I do not think is an if. I do think that that is a when. Um, and I think it's going to take darn near everything we have to combat that if this country decides to. So, on the Iranian front, I guess actually just the Middle Eastern front, when you look at all of the proxy groups that are going to be involved over there, I think, frankly, if we're not careful, you know, a conflict with Iran really could spill over into something that would make our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan kind of blush, because I think that there's the possibility that a conflict there, if we moved troops in and we had boots on the ground, like a significant number of troops, um, I mean, I think it would take years and years and years.
Oh yeah, I think. Uh, Unfortunately, any type of a ground presence in Iran, I I want to have great faith in our armed services, and I hope the infantry gets to collect as many ears, scalps, and body parts as makes their little hearts happy, because that's just how I am. However, I don't know how successful a ground invasion of Iran goes on the basic principles of insurgency warfare and mountain warfare. I mean, if we look at the war in Afghanistan, Initially we kind of got in there, we took over a few larger cities, and then we kind of stalemated a counterinsurgency campaign through the mountains for 20 years. And Iran is Afghanistan on steroids. And I mean like steroids. Iran's terrain features in general makes Iran a fortress. Their mountain systems is incredible. Not to mention that Iran would be fighting as a conventional insurgency force instead of a non-state actor insurgency force. To say that the IRGC and the Taliban are the same type of, guerrilla fighters that we'd be fighting would be a horrible, horrible, horrible misinterpretation of the situation. Not only is there so much more Iranians than there is people that live in Afghanistan, let alone the Taliban, but the weapons access and skill levels and infrastructure that is built throughout Iran. I mean, I've talked about this with several buddies since the conflict has begun. Iran's been preparing for this conflict for 40 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
They always knew that the United States was going to smoke them in an air campaign.
Yeah. That's
why all of their money wasn't put into their F-14s that they somehow acquired. Yeah. It was put into their drone and missile programs that they're just popping out of tunnels all of the time in a Toyota and shooting a Shahed drone, over 1,000 kilometers and pretty precisely just hitting targets, which is really impressive. I by no means want to be perceived as being courteous to the Iranians, but you have to give your enemy credit where credit is due. Iran is fighting a much harder war so far than Israel and the U.S. is. We're fighting an air campaign directly over top of our targets, where Iran is engaging 7 or 8 different countries at this point in the war. I would say more consistently around the clock than we are targeting them at this point, and they're doing so over vast differences with significantly less civilian casualties compared to what we are doing to them. It's a very interesting conflict.
Yeah. Well, and I mean the reality of any conflict, and I'm sure you'll probably appreciate this, but I mean the reality of any conflict is is an air force and a navy important, of course. I mean you need those things in a modern militaristic context in order to gain the upper hand, but the way that a war is won is with boots on the ground, because you do have to, control that street or that, corridor. And, it's just, I guess, really when I kind of look at the conflict on Iran right now, I think that I can recognize the idea that a big motivation of this for the United States is to, take away another Chinese ally. Because, we just did that with Venezuela. We're trying to do it with Iran right now, but yeah, I mean, again, man, if we're not careful over there, it's going to really drag out, and especially the mountains on the western side, the Zagros Mountains, I believe they are kind of like what you were saying. I mean, they are intense, and geography still in a modern context. When we look at all the cool gizmos that militaries have, from tanks to trucks to drones, all this stuff, mountains have been used as a favorable terrain for effectively insurgents or forces that are at a disadvantage for thousands of years, and there's a reason for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too when you look at the regional dynamic right now. If you look at Iraq, Iran is almost not fighting or engaging any U.S. assets in Iraq at this point. I mean, the Iraqi militias that are, Shia, Iranian proxies, they're the ones doing all the fighting against the Americans at this point. I mean, Iran's not even using much munitions in that region at this point. And between Erbil and Baghdad, we're bogged down pretty hard for militias, and they're allowed to just roam freely and can conduct as much attacks as they want because the Iraqi government is either not or is incapable of controlling the problem, which is a bit of our own fault. And how we got into this to begin with in the grander scheme of history is all of these pro-Iranian militias we armed and trained to
Yeah.
fight ISIS because the Iraqi government was not capable of doing so.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these non-state actor militias we trained through the first Trump administration to fight ISIS, only for them to turn out to be Iranian proxies.
Yep.
You can kind of say the same thing about the entire region. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at like Oman, Oman has a kind of Saudi U.S. based government, very very Sunni. But if you look at the population of Oman, I believe, if I'm speaking of the wrong country, I apologize. But if you look at the population of Oman, they're very Shia and they're very pro-Iranian. And there's already been issues with riots against the Omanian government because they're pissed with their dealings with the United States. And so then I believe it's called the Arabian Gulf Shield Security Group or Forces or whatever it is, the joint coalition of all the Arabian countries that are predominantly Sunni. They had to start sending riot control to Oman when this all started because the population was pissed. I mean, so the whole region is just a hornet's nest.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, I'll say it, like the risk of a world war with where we are now. Because I mean, the reality of what's going on in the Middle East, especially when we look at proxy groups and just kind of their own, societal disagreements and cultural disagreements. Each one of those countries has its own challenges and risks and militias and, different groups that are going to be fighting each other. And, a lot of our, European allies have not really been very quick to, jump on this with us. There hasn't really been much of a desire to, I guess kind of help out so far. And so, it's if we start, let's say we go for, a full on, occupation of the country or something. And, we have to send in a couple 100,000 troops to get things going. I mean, you have Russia at conflict with Ukraine right now. We would need to move even more assets to the Middle East to deal with that, which would be a massive percent of our military. And, I made a video on this one a few days ago too, but it's the risk of, China seeing an opportunity to move on Taiwan, should the United States get bogged down in Iran, is extremely high. And the reality is that for China right now, the only real barrier that they have to acting on Taiwan is logistics of how they move that many troops, across over to the island. But also, do they really want to deal with us? Well, they might not have to deal with us as, much of a threat if, we have 30 or 40% of our military in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And,
and the other big, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and the reality is, when we look at a lot of our other allies in Europe or Australia or Japan, a lot of these countries rely very, very heavily on the United States for their protection and their defense from, budgetary or even just technology or equipment. And so, the reality is that the allies that we have, should China, act on Taiwan, I mean, they'll help and, they'll pull some weight, but, I mean, the majority of that burden is going to fall on, the U.S.
Yeah. And, really at this point, now that the damage assessment is becoming more and more clear, because, again, being unbiased here, the U.S. and Israel are involved in a information campaign war just as much as Iran is.
Mm-hmm.
We've lost a lot of radar and anti-air weapons in the Middle Eastern conflict so far, so much to the point where we're now moving things out of the Asian theater. The big controversy right now is with South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Their prime minister made a big hullabaloo about it because we moved the Patriot missile system and the THAAD battery out of the South Korean post, and where it's going to the Middle East to replace the two that we lost.
Yep.
So now South Korea is like, hey, you're jeopardizing regional security here by removing this stuff, and China sees that. if I was China, I'd wait a couple months, really see if this sticks in. How much can we burn through? And I'd take Taiwan. There's not a doubt. If there was ever a more beautiful time to do it, it's right now. We're stuck in a Middle Eastern conflict. Midterms are right around the corner. We still have a blockade of Cuba going around. We're doing all these anti-cartel stuff in South America. There's not going to be a better time.
No, there really wouldn't. And I guess just kind of one other thought that I had that's, just been kind of itching at the back of my mind. But I mean, we saw it in Ukraine, and I mean, it happens all over the world all the time. But effectively, one superpower or global power will fund kind of domestic organizations within a country to kind of start stirring stuff up. And so we saw it in eastern Ukraine before Russia ever invaded. Russia was funneling weapons and equipment and money to groups in eastern Ukraine. Well, it's not 1940 anymore in the United States. Because we were largely untouched during World War II. I think Japanese troops landed on a couple of islands in Alaska for a handful of days, but we never really saw anything on the homeland. But one of my big fears, particularly in a war with China, is I mean, China's a really big country too, and from a monetary perspective, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of equipment, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's probably plenty of sympathizers in the United States that would love to get that stuff from China, and I think China would seize on that opportunity too. So it's kind of scary stuff. I mean, it scares me. I'm not afraid to say that, but I think China acts on Taiwan, we get involved on effectively a two-front war. If we do end up getting into a major conflict with China as well, the risk of a draft is almost a statistical certainty. And then, the potential for something here at home is, possible.
I personally do not think that the U.S. Socially and politically is stable enough to survive internally a large-scale war, whether it's solely against Iran or it's against Iran and China, if we even get involved with China. I mean, we
Hmm.
have to ask ourselves at the end of the day, is Taiwan worth it? And I get it. I feel bad for the Taiwanese people because they're fighting a losing fight.
Oh yeah.
But we have to ask ourselves, I mean, is that worth it? I
Well,
mean, that is the
I'll
world there.
it is, and I'll share why I believe our government would believe that Taiwan is fully worth it. Which I'm
Because we're
sure.
already doing another Middle Eastern war.
Yeah. No, I was
The
gonna.
bar's not high.
Yeah. Yeah. It's Taiwan produces and I'm not gonna get this percentage right, but it's something like 60% or 70%
Mm,
of all of the chip manufacturing on a
mhm.
global stage. And so you
Yep.
look at the Strait of Hormuz, and about 20 to 30% of the world's oil supply flows out of the Strait of Hormuz. And what we're witnessing right now with all of the disruption that's been there, this is going to cascade, economically, logistically for years. It's going to be exactly like what happened with COVID, where, there were shortages on chips to make new cars after COVID for years. And so, big companies like, big leasing companies like Enterprise and stuff, they couldn't get their hands on new cars because there'd been such a major economic interruption. And
Mm,
we're gonna see this in the Strait of Hormuz for the next couple of years, I would imagine, because oil is not just used for filling your car; it's used for almost everything, plastics,
sure.
even refining metals. There's byproducts that come from the refining process that are used in working on metals. But in Taiwan, if China launches an invasion on Taiwan, Taiwan's plan to try to disincentivize them from doing that is they're going to destroy all of their chip manufacturing plants because they don't want to give that to China. Now, if that happens, and I'm talking these chips are used in everything. They're used in your
Everything.
phone. They're used in your refrigerator, like your smart refrigerator I'm talking about, not like your old one that, grandma passed down. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's used in everything. And so effectively, what the U.S. is risking by not getting involved in Taiwan is, I mean, honestly, just kind of another Great Depression, really.
Mhm. So I will counter
Yeah,
your thought process
please
there.
do, please do.
I personally think that once anything happens, Taiwan's chips are written off. Taiwan is either going to destroy all of their chip making capacity, China takes over their chip building capacity, or Taiwan is reduced to absolute rubbish because the U.S. is trying to defend it from China, and China just analog missile just destroys that island and probably all of the infrastructure that comes with it. So then we lost all the chips anyway,
Oh, that's
defending
true.
Taiwan, and now we're in a war with China. So then again, the question kind of comes back down to it. Which of the three options is better? Taiwan destroys all their own chips, China takes over Taiwan, and chips still, generally speaking, is still on the global market and gives us more time to hopefully move manufacturing back home, which is very far down the road. Anybody that actually keeps track of that industry knows we're talking 2035, if not later, before we see any actual real improvements on the homeland when it comes to chip manufacturing. And that's why there's a giant resource, Cold War going on right now.
Yeah. No, and that's
Or option three, it all gets destroyed in a war.
yeah, yeah. Well, and
like what's going on in the Middle East with oil, and all the oil fields are on fire.
yeah, yep. And that is a very good point. That is a very good point. I'll grant you that one for sure. That's I think a lot of my thought process rather comes from just the idea of Thucydides trap and Strauss-Howe generational theory, and I get bogged down a little bit in the weeds on some of that stuff, but I mean that's a very fair point. There's not really a ton of benefit for the U.S. in getting involved in something like that.
I personally don't think, if we are looking at it in the general theater of war for the Pacific, I don't think the U.S. can stop China from taking back Taiwan. That would be like saying China could just, take California from the United States.
Yeah.
Like, just the logistics involved with that. Yeah, I mean, we might have a better, generally speaking, logistically conventional military than China per se. But China is taking the perspective of the United States in World War II, where it's like, hey, we're going to McDonald's the hell out of our combat plans. Where it's like, fantastic, you destroyed 4 of our tanks, I have 40 more.
Yeah.
And then when I unload these, I'm going to go back and I'm going to pick up 40 more. And my troops may not be the most well coordinated, but congratulations, I just landed 8 million of them on Taiwan shores, and I've got another 8 million backed by the Chinese Liberation Naval Militia back on. Like, it's a McDonald's problem out of all of it. And China is probably watching the conflict with Iran right now. And I said this during the 12-day war last year, is that Yemen, the U.S. conflict with Yemen, and really you could say Israeli-U.S. conflict with Yemen, was a perfect example of how the war in Iran was going to go. We bombed the hell out of Yemen, and we've been doing it for years. Saudi Arabia's been, nipping at Yemen for years in this transitional council that everybody says is not the government, even though it controls, Yemen.
Yeah.
Yet somehow Yemen shut down its waterways pretty much indefinitely until it finally stepped back during the Palestinian negotiations, and there was some level of ground actually captured there. But Yemen, when they said, hey, we're shutting this down, they did. And they forced, from a logistics perspective, the U.S. naval forces in the region to eventually abandon the fight in Yemen. And we have to use the word abandon because we have to be realistic about capabilities. Yemen was able to throw endless cheap analog munitions at the United States at a rate at which the United States could not burn smart munitions to counteract the drones, the boats, the whole shebang. Until eventually we went, wow, we've burned through our entire stockpile of munitions to protect ourselves. Now we have to leave. We'll continue to bomb them, but it doesn't matter because they're just that resilient and that much cheaper than we are. And now we're seeing that in Iran. Congratulations. We blew up all of Iran's submarines, frigates, and conventional air weapons. Great. That does not solve the problem of tens of thousands of Shia drones they have hidden underground, plus their cluster munitions, plus all these ballistic missiles that every day our president claims is now gone, and then they just find more.
Yeah.
And I think China's watching this, and I think China's going to go, all right, well, we're just going to analog this war until we win.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's definitely something that China has, at their disposal. And it's absolutely a home field advantage situation where, logistically, they're going to have a challenge with, moving enough troops over to Taiwan in the initial, days and weeks of the conflict. But I mean, kind of to your point, I mean, shoot, man, I mean, they can toss 20 dudes on a fishing boat and start using a lot of that stuff because, as you mentioned earlier, it's a dictatorship, and most of their civilian craft are they're available for their navy to effectively utilize. So it's definitely. I mean, I think a war with China. I don't know that I really see us winning that one either, unfortunately. And it's not that I don't have confidence in, our military or anything like that. It's just logistically to, move assets from, our shores to theirs. We're the ones that have to make that trip. And it's not, it's not short. It's not easy. And yeah.
And at the end of the day, I don't know if it's a fight the American people care about.
No.
I don't think you're going to World War II rally the United States behind starting a war or really even retaliating per se. I mean, it's going to be a mixed. We're not the same country, and we have to recognize that. I don't even think we have the industrial capability to match today's, military capabilities. Again, we're in a cold resource war with China, Russia, Iran, and then our NATO partners right now on a lot of these critical minerals that are unfortunately being burned on AI data centers galore because we have to store 15 years of your freaking Facebook profile information indefinitely, and I don't know why. And store everything we put into. I've never even used AI, so that's a whole different field. But regardless, we're in a resource war, so we're not going to be able to just make these endless smart munitions that really are supposed to win us fights quickly. And I also don't think it's been fair through the Venezuelan conflict and now the Iranian conflict where people are like, oh, see, we're beating China's air weapons and radar systems. Look how easily we're beating them. And it's like, if you do anything about Chinese military doctrine, you would know that they are not sending out their best stuff to all these countries they're selling stuff to.
No.
They're selling old, repurposed Soviet Union era stuff to make side money and build regional partners, but they're not sending out their nice, fifth generation stuff and new radar systems and all that to Venezuela. Like, are you serious?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not. Definitely not. It's I don't know, man. I mean, on the global scale, it's definitely it's quite a predicament we find ourselves in because, in my opinion, the reality of China taking Taiwan in a lot of ways, I think that kind of seals it because once China can effectively display that level of power, the United States does not get involved. When we've said for so long that we will, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to just start seeing, alliances shift, countries going to China instead of the United States moving forward, and then the byproduct of that is we kind of lose the advantage of the petrodollar over the course of a decade or so, and life changes, I guess.
I also very much enjoy people's biased opinions on geopolitics and regional disputes because most people would say, hey, Taiwan has a right to self-determination. If they don't want to be a part of China, then it's kind of a duty of the world to help Taiwan not be a part of China. You would say that that's probably a generally accepted Western idea, correct?
Yeah, I mean we've seen that same kind of idea adopted in like regard to Ukraine. So,
So yeah, now we look at now let's look at Ukraine before 2022. Let's look at Ukraine when the Donbass and the other regions of Ukraine split off into a separatist alliance against Ukraine after what we can probably argue is a Western-backed color revolution in Ukraine in 2014. Would we not argue that from an unbiased perspective, those eastern portions of the country have the right to self-determination, considering that they're, a lot of them are Russian ethnic people to begin with. From an unbiased perspective, we have to be like, hey, those people have the right to self-determination. We should not be involved in this conflict, or we should be helping them. It's a very weird thing when you look at it. It's very weird how we measure things when you look at it from an unbiased perspective. And you can say the same thing about every conflict in the world going on right now.
yeah. Well, and that's one of the challenging parts for, I think most people, right? Is because if you really want to get super granular with any conflict, you can go and do a deep dive into, Ukraine and Ukrainian history and Russia and Russian history, and you can look at Eastern Ukraine and you can say, well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the folks there, they actually do sympathize with Russia and they do want to be a part of Russia, but for the vast majority of folks, and I certainly don't blame them, a lot of folks are working, full-time jobs, they're trying to support a family, and
Sure.
it's hard to it's hard to go that deep a lot of the time. So a lot of the time we just look at a map, and it shows the big country of Ukraine versus the much bigger country of Russia, and it's like, oh man, I'm rooting for the underdog there, and it's like I get it, but
Sure.
it's the complexity of really any conflict is it's so much more profound than I think a lot of people really give it credit for. It's just it's war is not a simple thing.
No. I mean, even if you look at the conflict in Central Africa right now between
And
the DRC and the rebels, and then that are really backed by Rwanda.
mhm.
The whole reason there's a conflict to begin with is not necessarily because the Congo has issues being the Congo. It's the fact that a bunch of European countries drew imaginary borders at some point in time and didn't realize that they put two very different ethnic groups in the same box who would have
Yeah.
inevitably end up fighting each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and you could say that's very true for a lot. I mean, you look at India. India has tons of religious or various ethnic paramilitary organizations in it that constantly attack like Indian security forces. It's because the country's full of so many different people. Same for
Yeah.
Pakistan. I guess I should self-correct myself earlier too, because earlier I named 5 big countries. There's actually like 14 countries between the size of India and Iran. However, when I looked at the list, like 8 of the 14 countries are actually either actively in a civil war or have a ton of mini civil wars going on right now. So
Yeah.
it kind of just reinforced the point of it's really hard to get people of that scale to all agree and coexist together.
Yeah. Well, and it's
And the
like,
Congo was one of them.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's like I think the ongoing Myanmar conflict is a great example of that too, because
Oh my gosh, that's been going on forever.
yeah, I think it's approaching its 68th year at this point. And
crazy.
it's like when you look at the size of Myanmar compared to a lot of these other places we've been talking about, Myanmar is relatively or comparatively small.
I don't
And
even know how there's people left.
no, well, it's I think they have something like it's like 11 or 1200 different, quote unquote factions. And in large part, that's a byproduct of how long the conflict's been going on because, one faction splinters off into 2, splinters off into 10, and so on and so forth. But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, I think Myanmar is a fascinating conflict to look at and just kind of read about because, yeah, that just really elucidates the idea that like conflict is complex. It is not a simple game.
Even like, you take the Philippines, someone we would consider a relatively strong Asian ally, in a relatively well put together country per Southeast Asia standards. But they went through a 10+ year strand, and really they're kind of still dealing with it, where like these outer islands of the Philippines turned out to be like these giant ISIS strongholds, and they had to do this giant island hopping campaign through the 2010s fighting Filipino ISIS. And most people probably don't even know that happened.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I remember at the time seeing little stories pop up, or little videos about some very intense firefights down in the Philippines, and I remember watching some of those at the time, and just I was like, I had no idea. Like, who would have guessed ISIS was a big problem down in the Philippines? And yeah, I mean, it's yeah.
You have Moldova and Transnistria in Europe, which borders Ukraine and Russia. A breakaway region that's one's Eastern Bloc and the other one's kind of Western Bloc. And they're just also kind of waiting for their day to finally start shooting at each other. I mean, the whole world is definitely a lot more destabilized than you really think that it is.
Yeah. Well, I know, I believe effectively right now it's the most ongoing conflicts, for I believe it's the last 80 years, if that sounds right, maybe 60. But
Civil War in Sudan.
Yeah, it's just there really are a lot of conflicts going on right now, and it's again just kind of everything else we've been talking about, and what I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the podcast starting, just kind of reading the writing on the wall. I just I pray for peace. But I don't know, just learning some new skills and, being a little more prepared isn't the worst thing in the world.
Sure. No, I get it. Lots of deep conversation we've had.
Yeah, this has been wonderful. Thank you.
No, this has been great. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invite. I was, I pretty much ran out of my office to my fiance when you messaged me, and I was like, guy wants me to be on his podcast. That's awesome.
We discussed way more than I thought we were going to discuss. I'll be very honest.
Yeah, we dove deep, man. We were all over the place, but it was I had fun.
No, this was good. I think the listeners are really going to enjoy it. There's a lot of thought-provoking conversation in here, and that's really the big idea at the end of the day. Provoke critical thinking amongst all of the people that listen to this, and the guests that come on, and so on and so forth, bringing back that conversation and dialect we talked about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, where can guys, I guess, find you the best? Where can folks find all your content?
Yeah, so I'm over on YouTube at Civilian Rifleman, and you can follow me on X and Instagram as well. Not as active on those, but if you'd like to help a guy that's just trying to get going and kind of get things started so I can try to build a business out of this, I'd super appreciate it. And I also have some upcoming courses over on my website, civilianrifleman.com. So those would be the 4 places.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, buddy, for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me again. I had a wonderful time, and I really appreciate it, man. Thank you.
No, thank you. All right, everyone. That's all I have for episode 45, The American Rifleman. As always, train hard, train often.
Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Strength in numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours. Tell me turn it down and